Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to each one of you who has joined us today for this session on assessing the situation of COVID-19 and international trade and health. COVID-19 has changed a lot, not least that today we are meeting over Zoom rather than an in-person conference that we would normally have in Thailand. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the PMAC Secretariat and all of us over here. A few housekeeping announcements. We do want to announce that there is going to be a space for a Q&A function. So do type in your questions as we go along. And between me from the regional office and my colleague Liviu from the WHO country office in Thailand, we'll do our best to make sure our eminent panelists answer most of your questions. And also that those who wish to see the rerun of the session are welcome to visit the PMAC2021.org as the session gets over. And in this context, let me first of all welcome our eminent panelists. We have Andrew Hill with us, who has been specializing for many, many years on access to medicines. And he has been looking at the costs of many and manufacturing costs of many of the pharmaceutical products. We also have with us Catherine Bond, who brings with her experience not only on the US Pharmacopoeia and the US Food and Drug Administration, but she's also been working on strengthening regulatory systems. And we have with us Professor Ronald Labonte, who is looking at many issues on globalization and the issues that are really critical in terms of international trade and health. Has been looking at health equity, which is so very critical in the COVID-19 situation. And we have with us Sudarshan Jain, who is the Secretary General of the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance, and he performed a very vital role in COVID-19 as the movement of medical products was being tracked over the last 7 to 8 months or so. In this context, in COVID-19 response, it's changed so much even in WHO. When we see in May, it was the first time that the World Health Assembly had only one resolution on that was passed, and that was on the COVID-19 response. And if we looked at that resolution, it talked of many of the issues that we are going to cover today in this session on international trade and health, because they looked at issues with respect to sharing knowledge and information for affordable diagnostics, therapeutics, medicines, and vaccines. And they also talked about equitable and affordable access in the context of the trade-related intellectual property rights agreement and the Doha Declaration. These are some of the trade-related issues, including the ISDS, which Professor Labonte is going to bring to us on the table. And also with respect to the CTAP, which is the COVID Technology Access Pool, where they talked about pledging information and access, and also working through the Medicines Patent Pool and the UN Technology Bank. But more importantly, when we look at the COVID Access Tools Accelerator, access to COVID-19 tools, this looks at to accelerate the development and availability of diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. And in the area of therapeutics, this is where Professor Andrew Hill's presentation is going to be so critical, as he looks at repurposing of many of the existing drugs and therapeutics for availability during COVID-19. One of the biggest advantages of repurposing is that we already have information with respect to the safety aspects. So if it is efficacious in COVID-19, it's a faster way of getting our products ready for COVID-19. And not least, we will have Catherine Bond, who will look at the various aspects with respect to SF products and ensuring quality supplies. And then, of course, Sudarshan Jain will tell us how it all happened. So with these initial remarks, it gives me immense pleasure to welcome Professor Andrew Hill to tell us how exactly these products, when we look at therapeutics, how can they be made available, and how does the repurposing work, and how does the access issues look at in the COVID-19 context? Over to you, Professor Andrew Hill.
Thank you very much for introducing me, and welcome to everybody from Liverpool University, where basically, like many of you, COVID-19 has taken over my life. It's all I do, 12 hours a day, trying to find these new treatments, setting up clinical trials, working out how we could access new treatments. And there's a huge amount of activity going on worldwide. What I want to talk about today is what we could do right now until vaccines or new experimental treatments can be developed. It can take many years to provide a vaccine. I started working on HIV in 1988. I was told by my professor at Oxford University, don't do it, don't work on HIV, we'll have a vaccine in a year. And every year since then, people have been talking about the prospects. But I think until we get the vaccine, the new experimental treatments, we need to work with what we have right now. And we need things urgently. The number of deaths per day rises constantly. The idea with repurposed drugs is you take drugs previously developed to treat other diseases, which are widely available and cheap, with a good safety profile, and see if they work against COVID-19. The advantage there is that if they do work, they can be deployed immediately. And if you look at this success story of dexamethasone from the United Kingdom recovery trial, we have our first drug which showed to improve survival for people requiring oxygen with COVID-19. And we can see the survival benefits straight away, and it's a drug that can be taken straight off the pharmacy shelves and used. Now, the World Health Organization has issued guidelines, what they're looking for with these repurposed drugs. Ideally, they want drugs that improve survival. They will accept drugs that simply reduce the progression of the disease or lower the duration of hospital stays. They're looking for drugs with once daily simple oral dosing, a shelf life of at least 36 months, room temperature shipping. So the simple drugs should have the highest priority. And I'm working with UNITAID and the World Health Organization on a system of different clinical trials to try and prove which drugs do and don't work. And you can see here you have many different alternatives: antivirals, immunomodulators, host-directed drugs, combination regimens, and then among the more novel treatments, there are new antivirals being developed by pharmaceutical companies from scratch. And you have new monoclonal antibodies. It will take longer to develop those drugs rather than repurposing, because then you have to characterize the safety profile from square one and get a full approval of the drug, which is much longer than repurposing a drug like dexamethasone, where you already know the safety profile. So for each of these drugs, we have a timetable, and we know when we're going to start seeing the first results emerge. If you look at our work so far on antivirals, unfortunately, it's been very tough. We've had a huge number of clinical trials, initially looking at hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, lopinavir, ritonavir, which is an HIV drug, darunavir, ritonavir, another HIV drug, and unfortunately, all of them have failed so far. There's no overall evidence that hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir or lopinavir improve survival, and the results from the WHO Solidarity study presented last month were a real shock, that there wasn't even an effect of remdesivir on the duration of hospitalization. So we don't have antiviral drugs at the moment. However, there is a rich pipeline of drugs from other diseases: favipiravir, an influenza drug, nitazoxanide used to treat Giardia cryptosporidiosis, atazanavir, an HIV protease inhibitor, sofosbuvir, declatosvir, velpatasvir, hepatitis C drugs, tenofovir to treat HIV, amidiaquine, which is an antimalarial. So you have all of these drugs being repurposed to treat COVID-19. Now, I was talking about remdesivir just now. If you look at the combined results of the studies conducted before Solidarity, even then, there was not a survival benefit. And there's something strange with remdesivir, where the death rates actually increase the longer you give it, which suggests there might be some sort of kidney or or hepatic toxicity in play. And then the results of the Solidarity study basically showed that this drug is not benefiting people. So this is unfortunate, but this is something we're having to get used to with COVID-19 research. There is a high failure rate in the trials, but we only need 1 or 2 of these drugs to work to have a solution that we could roll out worldwide. We've got newer drugs like favipiravir, which is an influenza drug originally developed in Japan. It's been looked at in Russia in this study. It's also been looked at in China, in India, and the results are interesting. It looks like drugs like this need to be used very early in treatment. And my team is working with an international group based out of Iran and South Africa and Egypt on studies of very, very early antiviral treatment, a same-day test and treat system where people are given a rapid antigen or PCR test, and the result is known within maximum 1 hour and preferably 20 minutes. The moment they find out they're positive, they're given antivirals. And the idea with these antivirals is they should work very early in the course of infection, rather like Tamiflu worked against influenza. So this is a new strategy that's being developed. And the advantage of these studies, if they're run in the right countries quickly, you can get results within a very short space of time. We're anticipating getting results from this combination of hepatitis C drugs, sofosbuvir, clatosphere plus favipiravir, within the next 3 months. And then we have, taking the antivirals to one side, we have other strategies. You have immunomodulators like dexamethasone, which has shown a benefit. Unfortunately, other approaches, tocilizumab, interferon beta, have not shown benefits so far. Looked at in quite large studies, interferon beta was also included in the Solidarity trial. There are other drugs being looked at, though, in the same vein: losartan, colchicine, famotidine, imatinib, which is an old cancer drug, baricitinib, and then the more experimental treatments like the one from Eli Lilly, the monoclonal antibody. This is the great success story from repurposing. This is the National Health Service recovery trial, which showed an overall 17% reduction in mortality for people taking dexamethasone versus no additional treatment. And there was a larger survival benefit for people who are on mechanical ventilation. So this shows that the repurposed drugs can work. And if 1 or 2 work, there's the potential to save literally tens of thousands of lives if the drug is deployed worldwide. Now, the issue with deploying a drug worldwide, let's say we have a drug that does work, you can just imagine the size of the demand for these drugs. And my team has been looking over several years at how much drugs cost to make. And you can see in HIV, in hepatitis, in tuberculosis, it's possible to mass produce drugs so that you can treat millions of people for a very low unit price. HIV can be treated for $75 per person per day, per year. Hepatitis C can be cured for $50. And similarly with tuberculosis, can we do the same for COVID-19 and get this ideal treatment that improves survival, is incredibly cheap to make, and can be rolled out to treat millions of people? We've looked at the prices and the costs of the main repurposed treatments. This is dexamethasone, and you can see in almost any country this is an affordable drug. A 10-day course of dexamethasone costs only $1 in India or China or Bangladesh, and even in the richer countries, a price of up to $28 is still extremely affordable given the survival benefit it provides. And there is enough dexamethasone being produced to treat literally millions of people. And Unitaid has been working with the World Health Organization to make sure there are enough supplies being built up through the pharmaceutical industry to treat everybody in need. Then you look at other drugs. This is a drug called nitazoxanide, and it's shown interesting results in a new study come out of Brazil. And look at the difference in price. You've got a drug which is $3 in India, $3 in Bangladesh or Pakistan, $4 in Egypt, 38 in Brazil, and then between $2,000 and $4,000 in the United States. So this is in the United States, the production is organized by a company called Romark, who have rights to produce it there. And how would this work out? Let's say nitrous oxide had the same benefit as dexamethasone. How many people in the United States could afford up to $4,000 for 14 days of treatment when they knew that the drug could be produced for $3 in India? Will we see a new phase of compulsory licensing and patents being broken to make sure that everybody can access the drug at a fair price? And this is not just an issue for nitrous oxide. If you look here at this graph of this table showing prices versus costs for a range of repurposed drugs, you can see that if sofosbuvir declatosphere, the hepatitis C combination, showed benefits, that treatment on its own would cost $13,000 per person for a course of treatment, versus $5 in India. Nitrous oxide we've just discussed. Remdesivir, despite costing $2,300 in the United States, is actually a very cheap drug to make. It's already being manufactured in India and sold for a price 85% less than the US price. And the cost price in our hands is around $1 per day. Other people have estimated around $5 per day. So we need to think about the fairness of the large pharmaceutical companies charging way above cost price for drugs which they haven't actually funded the development of in a meaningful way, when other governments and donors have provided huge amounts of funding for the development of these drugs. We see this same pattern to a lesser extent for some of the other drugs like atazanavir. But once drugs are very old and there are many generic copies available, you can see that the prices can be low either in high income or low income countries. Why should these drugs be sold at close to cost price? If you think about what's happened with COVID-19, this is such an urgent situation that the main donors and governments have just come forth with huge amounts of funding, and the clinical trials have been funded mainly by government grants and donors. And even if pharmaceutical companies donate drugs for the trials, they're typically given a tax rebate, and pharmaceutical companies can actually make a profit from simply donating drugs for running in clinical trials. We need to remember these drugs are working by accident. There's been very little research and development from the pharmaceutical companies on most of these repurposed drugs. They've simply been tried out against COVID-19. How much drug could we need if a drug proves to be successful? So let's think about two different models. If we wanted to treat people with moderate or severe infection, given that there have been 1.2 million deaths so far in 2020, and the death rate in moderate severe infection is approximately 10%, we would need 12 million courses next year to treat that same number of people. 12 million courses is possible, but it needs a lot of organization with generics companies. If we wanted to go one stage back and look at treating everybody diagnosed with mild COVID, we're talking about production demands in the region of 40 million people per year. Can we manufacture 40 million courses of treatment? Absolutely, of course we can. These are short treatment courses. We're already supplying 21 million people worldwide with constant HIV drugs, triple combinations for life. So they're treated every single week. We're talking about 40 million courses of treatment, probably between 7 and 10 days per person. So there is the potential to do this. Now, so the implications of all this for mass production are, we need to look at these clinical trial plans in more detail. Think about which drugs are most likely to succeed. Is it going to be a high dose combination treatment used early in infection as an antiviral? Which of the drugs for other mechanisms of action, the immunomodulators, are most likely to succeed? We're seeing results come out from confirmatory phase 3 studies every few weeks at the moment, and we need to be able to reply to these results with demand forecasts in real time. And I think there's a huge potential to get these repurposed drugs working once we see the success of the next trial. So I'm actually very optimistic. We only need to get this right once or twice in order to have a solution for COVID-19 worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. And that was a very elaborate presentation. And thanks for pointing out the issues with respect to availability and price, and the very difficult question on fair price when we look at across different jurisdictions. And this is something that has been engaging us for extremely long time, including in WHO and all the national governments. And that takes us very well to our second presentation, which is where I welcome Catherine Bond, who's going to speak about ensuring medical products we can trust. So on the one hand, we talk about availability and supplies, and then it's the question of how to ensure quality of the drugs and the medical devices and diagnostics that come onto the market. To those of us who have been following this, if you recall, it was a very difficult acronym, the SSFFC, which was substandard, spurious, falsely labeled, falsified, counterfeit medicines, which finally in 2017, WHO member states decided to call it the substandard and falsified medicines and made it much simpler for us to address many of these quality issues. So with these words, I welcome Catherine, and over to you for your presentation. And please do tell us how we can make sure that in COVID-19, we get the quality drugs and diagnostics and devices that we are looking forward to. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Manisha, and sincere thanks to the Secretariat of PMAC for organizing this very important session. It's an honor to join the other distinguished panelists to discuss this threat of substandard and falsified medicines in the COVID-19 era. And this issue is really underappreciated in the broader context of access to medicines, health, and trade, but really underpins the efficacy of public health intervention. So it's critical that we all work to ensure medical products work as intended. I'll be discussing the unprecedented urgency to ensure access to safe, efficacious, quality medical products for all. And Dr. Hill has indicated where we see promising interventions. I'll describe a little bit about the complexity of the globalized medical product access and regulation, including the supply chain, the access roadmap of WHO, and regulatory processes. And then what do we know so far with respect to substandard falsified medicines in COVID-19, and what more needs to be done to assure medicines we can trust? So there's unprecedented urgency for equitable access to safe, quality, efficacious medical products, really not only for COVID, but for all vaccines and essential medicines. And we continue to see reports of falsified and harmful products, false claims, shortages due to supply chain disruptions, and at the same time, world leaders calling for a united response in ensuring access and new initiatives that are forming to support their development and delivery. From the mid-2000s to today, production of medicines and vaccines has become a global enterprise, challenging regulators to oversee quality, safety, and efficacy across jurisdictions. And in the United States, you'll see 80% of ingredients from medicines come from overseas, with largely the ingredients from China and the manufacturing taking place in India. Since 2012, regulators have established and strengthened collaborative networks to share information, converge standards, and work share. But COVID-19 has raised alarms about the impact of supply chain disruptions on access to essential medicines as a national security issue. Last year, WHO launched the Access Roadmap, which is comprised of two streams, those involving the regulation of products and those promoting access. And much of the discussion on access emphasizes the processes in the right side of the column here, including research and development, management of intellectual property, pricing, procurement, prescribing, and distribution. And this is largely what I think Dr. Hill and Dr. Labonte are addressing. However, the left side refers to the regulation and the need to ensure quality, safety, and efficacy products, including regulatory system strengthening, the pre-qualification of medicines, post-market safety, and vigilance. Regulation happens at all phases of the product's life cycle. For example, under a robust regulatory system for a vaccine to be approved, it needs to first submit an investigational new drug application describing the vaccine, its method of manufacture and quality control tests, and information on safety and ability to elicit immune response in animals. Then undergoes 3 phases of clinical trials, phase 1 are safety and immunogenicity studies, phase 2 dose ranging studies, and phase 3 to document the effectiveness and safety data for licensing. And each phase can enroll progressively more human subjects. If these phases are successful, the applicant submits a biological license application reviewed by national regulatory reviewers who look at data to make a risk-benefit assessment, and then in turn, the sponsor would submit to independent expert committees to advise on safety and efficacy. The products also need to have adequate labeling for proper use by providers, including benefits and risks, and information for the public. And after approval, regulators continue to monitor for product safety and conduct facility inspections, reports of adverse events. And in countries that manufacture vaccines, they also need to show a system of lot release, use of laboratories when needed, regular inspections for good manufacturing practices, and evaluation of clinical performance. But regulations and regulatory systems are chronically underfunded, and WHO works with countries to assess their functions according to a global benchmarking tool. As of last year, only a third of the world's regulatory authorities demonstrated their basic functions. And so the World Health Organization's pre-qualification program, which mirrors the processes of national authorities for essential medicines and listed products, is all the more critical to ensure availability of products to member states. As Manisha mentioned, substandard and falsified medicines present a threat to patients in public health, and these definitions, which were approved in a World Health Assembly last year, reflect a shift from a focus on intellectual property and counterfeit products to a public health focus. And so substandard medicines are those called out of specification, that are authorized medical products that fail to meet either the quality standards or specifications or both. Unregistered and unlicensed products are products that have not undergone evaluation or approval by a national regulatory authority for the market in which they're marketed and distributed or used, and are subject to permitted conditions under national or regional regulation and legislation. Falsified medical products deliberately, fraudulently misrepresent their identity, composition, or source. So in the context of COVID, we can already see that a long-standing concern of substandard and falsified medicines is exacerbated. We see such products proliferating in greater volumes and a wide range of products, in part due to shocks in supply, increases in demand, and new channels of distribution, as well as a fluid regulatory environment and overburdened regulators. Colleagues at Oxford University have tracked over 300 published articles in the period of January to September across 56 countries, and these document both substandard and falsified health products related to COVID, including test kits, hand sanitizers, and masks. We saw considerable hydroxychloroquine reports earlier in the spring, dexamethasone, remdesivir, and falsified COVID-19 vaccines. We also recognize that WHO has issued a number of global alerts and notices reflecting increased reports of substandard and falsified medical products related to COVID. But it's not just the COVID products that we're concerned about. The broader environment means that we need to be vigilant about all essential medicines. There's a dearth of national and global data on the drivers of substandard and falsified medicines, which presents a further challenge, but we do see some patterns emerging. Events such as COVID-19 do exacerbate the vulnerabilities and create new shocks in the form of ingredient shortages, border closures, and limited supply of finished products. The increased demand for essential medicines that is not accompanied by supply create possibilities of substandard medicines if supply disruptions or ingredient pricing pressures push manufacturers to cut corners. Limited sources of ingredients, rising costs of ingredients, and transportation challenges also create pressures on suppliers. And we've seen reports of falsified products as bad actors exploit vacuums in the market, and regulators are overburdened in terms of both the detection and enforcement functions. So procurement planning is to account for disruptions and threats is critical, but often insufficient, especially as the spikes in demand are unpredictable. We have limited evidence linking price specifically to SF medicines. However, the affordability in the local context, as well as the availability of products, is a critical factor in terms of patients having exposure or lack of choice with respect to what's in the market. And finally, the burden on regulators to approve products can also result in relaxed approvals or weakened post-market oversight. There's surprisingly limited information, even among regulators, about the ingredients, manufacturers, and suppliers across the supply chain. And so supply chain transparency really needs to be improved by increasing information sharing by industry about traceability, planned and unplanned changes in supply and expected impact of supply disruptions, regulators sharing information among each other, which is currently in some cases limited by statutes. Prescribers sharing information to understand the demand and improve forecasting and planning. And currently in many countries, reporting by industry is voluntary. And so moving to mandatory reporting could help gain line of sight into supply chains to ensure that consistent supply and reduce threats to product quality. Further strengthening national and global reporting is critical. National authorities are beginning to strengthen their post-market surveillance capacities, focusing on products of highest risk to the public health. And in the context of COVID, those products that were outlined by Dr. Hill would be among the priorities. In this slide, you can see the process then that national regulators use to report incidents to WHO's global surveillance and monitoring system. This information is entered into a portal. It's then followed up by WHO to determine the characteristics of the suspect product. And WHO works with the national authorities who would then take enforcement actions. If the product is likely to be found beyond a nation's borders, WHO issues a global product alert. And the data compiled in all of this is then analyzed to determine the broader global prevalence of substandard and falsified products. WHO and member states have been working for the last several years to improve systems to prevent, detect, and respond to substandard and falsified medicines in the market. And this slide describes further actions that national authorities and procurement entities can take across both streams of the access roadmap. To date, much of the work has focused on the detect capabilities, the ability to do risk-based post-market surveillance and create a regulatory reporting culture and target sentinel surveillance in collaboration between regulators and procurers. We also need greater response in terms of coordination. But this dimension of procurement, fair pricing, prescribing, dimension, and rational use tends to happen outside the remit of regulators alone. So collaboration with procurers and those involved in other dimensions of access is essential. Finally, we can see that regulators face tremendous political pressures. And so citizens' vigilance is all the more important now. And the Medicines We Can Trust Coalition was actually born out of a side meeting held at the PMAC conference in 2018. It's comprised over 350 organizations and individuals advocating for medicines we can trust. And we welcome all of you to join this movement and keep track of information, resources as they come about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine. And that was a good summary of many of the issues that are related to the quality and safety aspects as we move across supply chains. I thought it was very interesting that you brought about collaboration between regulation, procurement, and industry. That's really critical. If the three are able to get together and iron out the quality issues, I'm sure we will be there. And I would be happy to, and we would really want to know how exactly you think this kind of collaboration could take place without the conflict of interest issues that we normally face when we're trying to address it in international and national jurisdictions. And that brings us very well to our next speaker, Ronald Labonte, who's actually going to deal with some of the most critical issues when we look at the trade aspects in terms of the trade agreements and how they are addressed and how the movement of products takes place across different jurisdictions. It is interesting to note that under the WTO mechanism, countries are expected to report a lot of what they do in international trade. And we would like to hear from Professor Labonte, how is that system functioning in the COVID-19 situation? And how does he see that progressing? And also the rather difficult aspect on the ISDS mechanism, which I hope he will explain in a little more detail, and which is something that is quite a cracker for everyone. Over to you, Professor Labonte.
Okay, thank you very much, Manisha. And I am going to talk about something a little bit different than I think many people so far have been addressing. I'm going to talk about some of the trade policy issues, and in particular, how it pertains to some of the supply chain, initially, the supply chain matters with respect to COVID-19. Most of my talk is actually going to be on investor-state dispute settlement risks, which are sitting there in the background. They haven't arisen yet, but they very likely will arise and have some pretty enormous implications. So to begin with, I want to talk about the issue of notifications. So under the WTO rules, any changes that members might want to make to their regulations that could relate to trade rules need to be communicated to the WTO. And relative to COVID, the WTO has already received a number of notifications of changes that are pertinent to medical supplies, as you can sort of see on the slide here. And now members are able to determine the conditions under which they feel it's necessary to protect health and social welfare. And that kind of applies to any kind of measures they take to either incentivize more trade or restrict aspects of trade relative to some of these medical supplies. But under the WTO rules, these new changes to their trade policy have to be temporary, they have to be justified, and they have to be non-discriminatory. So for food restrictions, countries also have to give consideration to food security issues of other member states if they're going to restrict some of the export of foods in order to keep an essential supply of needed commodities there. There's also a general exception rule under the GATT agreement that allows countries to basically seek an exception to any of the trade rules for purposes of supporting or promoting, protecting animal, human, environmental health. Those particular aspects, however, under the general exception rule have proved quite challenging or quite difficult to actually use during an actual dispute. With COVID-19, most countries are actually concerned more with lowering their tariffs and incentivizing the imports of medical supplies and not trying to ban them. But there have been some notifications that restricted trade in some supplies or in live animals to reduce zoonotic risk. The same criteria to those sorts of restrictions under the Sanitary and Phytosanitary Standards Agreement, for instance, are identical to those on the technical barriers to trade restrictions, which is that they have to be temporary, they have to be justifiable, and they have to be non-discriminatory. Now, it's important, I think, to note that at this point in time, there have been no trade challenges or disputes concerning supply chain measures that countries have undertaken. And in fact, many of those that restrict trade, you don't really imagine that countries will try to launch a dispute because it's increasing trade, because that's the principle of trade agreements, is to increase trade. Most of the ones that have restricted trade have already been repealed. There is, of course, concern that with the second wave emerging in many countries now, that there could be new restrictions put in place. And we haven't necessarily solved in some reasonable way what the supply chain issues are. Also concerned that the attempt to kind of move to a reshoring or a kind of national production of many of the medical supplies necessary to intervene in, treat, prevent, or mitigate COVID-19 could lead to a deterioration in the medical product global supply chain. And that has implications, especially for low-income countries that may not have the kind of capacity to produce domestically what's needed. So as high-income countries with that capacity look to sort of try to source all of their future anticipated needs from within their own borders and to avoid breakdowns in global supply chains, that could come at a cost in terms of what's accessible in low-income countries. Now, we've already heard a little bit about drugs and treatments, vaccines, and intellectual property rights. There's going to be a lot more of that happening in a webinar tomorrow that will probe into some more of the detailed issues. And Andrew gave us, I think, a pretty good prelude in terms of looking at some of the price differential questions with respect to the patented versions or the generic versions or different cost mechanisms and the huge gap in terms of pricing. So if we look at TRIPS, there have been a number of notifications that have been made, that countries have made, regarding changes in how they deal with patents and intellectual property rights. Most of these are for the first three, which is really about trying to streamline the process of administration or filing of new patents, to help countries know what's publicly available by publishing patent landscape data. So what kinds of treatments are already off patent or are available to be used without sort of having to incur a problem, a potential TRIPS related problem or obligation. It's the last one. There have been some developments here, and that's the measures to try to increase the speed of compulsory licensing. So we know that there's at least about 4 or 5 countries that have passed legislation since March to empower public health officials to issue compulsory licenses for COVID-related drugs, devices, or diagnostics. And compensation or royalties to the patent holder would only be settled after the fact. Chile and Ecuador are the 2 most recent countries to have done that, alongside France, Germany, Hungary, and Canada. Now, the UK and the USA have not necessarily done that, but they actually don't need to, because they have existing legislative powers that allow them to appropriate use of inventions in case of emergency, or in the case of the United States, that they were partly publicly funded. Canada, rather curiously, and I'm not quite sure why, actually allowed its rapid kind of legislative change to put in place compulsory licensing. It allowed that amendment to its Patent Act to expire in September 30th of this year. I'm not quite sure why. Still trying to find out. But you'll hear most of that. You'll hear a great deal of that tomorrow, because one of the more far-reaching initiatives around TRIPS and access to essential medicines is the call for a temporary TRIPS waiver on all COVID-related medical products. And that was proposed by South Africa and India. Now, that was discussed at the TRIPS Council in middle of October. And there was considerable developing country support. Some developing countries said they needed to contact their national governments first to make sure what the legal implications would be. But it was also opposed by many developed countries that were part of that particular meeting, who were arguing that existing TRIPS flexibilities provided sufficient means for compulsory licensing. But that's, unfortunately, that's on a case-by-case and product-by-product only basis. And parallel importing requires even more time-consuming negotiations, unique packaging, specified quantities, specific purposes, and so forth. Others have argued that maybe TRIPS Article 73, which is a security exception, could actually be invoked, and arguing that the pandemic constitutes an emergency in international relations and allowing countries, therefore, to take any steps necessary to protect essential security interests. But that could still be subject to a trade challenge. So there's still a lot of momentum, a lot of discussion, a lot of dissonance in terms of how to manage the intellectual property rights as we go forward with whether it's repurposed drugs or whether it was with new vaccines. The proposal for a TRIPS waiver, which will still require 3/4 approval of the General Council of the WTO members if it actually proceeds to that level, is expected sometime in November or possibly early next year. Now, because others are going to be addressing IPR issues in more detail, especially tomorrow, my main focus is really going to be on the potential for investment treaties, the international investment agreements, to create costly investor-state disputes. It's initially important to understand that bilateral investment treaties, and now they're part of often regional trade agreements, that they're intended to promote foreign direct investment in developing countries that were perceived as having weak judicial systems. So the idea here is that by offering investors recourse to international arbitration, they might be more likely to actually invest in countries that they're not certain that the judicial system may not be subject to political capture. It wasn't until the 1990s and increasing global market liberalization that there was a huge rush to ink many of these treaties. And even as their numbers proliferated, so did criticism of their use. There's a huge scope of interpretation in investment agreements. The size of the awards right now are getting larger and larger, and the tribunals now are sometimes making judgments of awards in the multi-billion-dollar range. Investor-state suits are highly profitable to the legal industry, and there have been a lot of complaints about deficits in procedural justice. Now, although the pace of new investment agreements has slowed to a trickle, and there's actually a greater number of termination of prior agreements that are outpacing creation of new ones, the number of active dispute cases remains large. And many of them have indirect health impacts because they're related primarily to changes in government policies that affect extractive industries and the environment. And a critical issue here is how the tribunals, the investor-state dispute settlement or ISDS tribunals, interpret the key provisions of these investment agreements. Now some of these are pretty straightforward. So national treatment, you basically treat foreign investors the same way you treat your domestic investors. Most favored nation, what you offer to foreign investors who belong to one country that is part of that treaty, you'd have to apply to foreign investors to other countries that are part of that treaty. Direct expropriation, that basically means you can't seize the assets of a foreign investor without providing compensation. And this notion of free transfer of capital basically means that money can go in and out of, investment can go in and out of a country without barrier. And a lot of that is about the ability of investors to repatriate their profits. Now, full protection and security of an investor's assets is a little more controversial because that can actually include a country's obligation to compensate for foreign investors' losses due to armed conflicts or domestic strife. But the most contentious ones are the two that are italicized. And they're also the most frequently alleged breaches of investment agreement rules and of tribunal rulings in favor of investors, and the ones most open to tribunal interpretation. There is particularly the case for fair and equitable treatment, that particular provision in investment agreements, because there is no consistent definition of what that means. And alleged breaches of fair and equitable treatment now account for 83% of all ISDS litigation. So that's the one that investment lawyers will tell you is the really tricky one that's very hard to actually defend against. Now, what does this mean for potential challenges to actions that governments have taken during the pandemic? And the first, if you take a look at the list over there on the left-hand side, is that now no ISDS has yet been initiated. I'll return to that in a moment. But there are very few measures that governments have taken during the pandemic that are not at some risk of triggering an investor lawsuit. And to the extent that any of these could be alleged to lower the value, any of these items on the left-hand side of this slide, that they could be alleged to lower the value of a foreign investment or even just a foreign investor's expectations of that value, the potential for an investor-state suit exists. Now, as I said, it hasn't happened yet. There's a lot of concern that it will happen. We're very close to one particular case in Ecuador, where Ecuador, in response to the pandemic, it suspended tolls on privately owned but foreign invested highways. And it did that to prevent transmission of COVID-19, of the virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, between toll staff and the drivers who were having to pay their tolls and their passengers in the car. So in order to prevent that transmission, they suspended all the tolls and shut down the toll process on the highways. Now, the foreign investors who own those highways were less than amused. And so they have been talking about launching an investor-state dispute case. And if that happens, it'll be the first one so far in terms of pandemic response. But there are a lot of international investment legal firms that have been very, very busy identifying and outlining the argumentative basis for such lawsuits. And this potential is exacerbated by the many procedural features of investment agreements, but a particular note now is an increasing tendency of private equity funds to function as third-party financiers for foreign investors. And that saves investors the legal costs. And in return, these third-party financiers will ask for up to 30 to 50% of the value of the award. So for these third-party financiers, these private equity or hedge fund speculators, it's a bit of a gamble. But given the potential value of awards that tribunals have been giving out, it's seen by such investors as a new form of highly profitable speculation. But of course, it's the citizens of the countries who are so sued who wind up paying the price of that speculation, often including at least part of their own legal fees, even when a tribunal rules against the foreign investor. So what can governments do? This is a bit of a sleeper issue about ISDS. It's there in the background, but not high on the political agenda. But it's one that governments really need to pay some attention to. So what can they do? And there's quite a lot, actually. There's a number of legal counter arguments that actions that governments took were in some way a response to an unforeseen force, the force majeure argument. The risk here is that zoonotic pandemics had long been foreseen, simply ignored. So it's a bit of a weak argument. Or it could be necessity, that the actions taken were necessary as the only ways to safeguard the essential interest, which is public health. That could be countered, though, that there are other ways that did exist, including proper pandemic preparedness and healthcare financing in advance. It could also be argued distress, that the pandemic created this massive distress and a need on the part of governments to save lives. That argument, though, is intended only for very specific emergencies, and it's questionable whether the pandemic as a general emergency would actually qualify. So these are potential counter arguments if a government faces a lawsuit from a foreign investor, but they're pretty weak ones. One that holds a bit more possibility could be police powers, and that provides states with the right to regulate for matters of public safety and health. This could provide a defensive argument, but it's not regarded as an affirmative defense in claims around fair and equitable treatment. And you recall that fair and equitable treatment is the most interpretive rule under investment agreements and the most common alleged breach that is now being made. Now, there are also exceptions within investment agreements that could be invoked. But these are more common in trade agreements than in investment agreements. And even there, as I said earlier, they've been quite challenging to use successfully. They often stumble over the necessity test that someone could counter-argue, a country could counter-argue, or an investor could counter-argue. Was this really necessary? Were there not other options, other ways of coping with that particular problem? So moving to a much more preventative vein, governments could simply notify their investment treaty partners that they refuse to consent to arbitration until further notice. This is possible for them to do, but so far, this is an untested measure, and it's not known whether it could still be challenged by a foreign investor. Governments could also start to terminate their investment agreements, and many developing countries have already done so, particularly since there's very little evidence of their stated intent that they would stimulate foreign investment. It's actually transpired, but costly investor suits have materialized. Now, generally, this would require agreement by all parties to the particular agreement to terminate the investment accord. And obviously, that would be much easier in a bilateral investment treaty, which exists only between two countries. Otherwise, there are problems with long sunset clauses of 15 to 30 years that could keep states vulnerable to agreements if those states decided to just simply unilaterally terminate the investment agreement. This is why if they could get their partners to the agreement to agree, then it would save the problem around potential investor suit for the kind of actions governments took in the light of the pandemic. A more immediate measure actually would be for governments to sign a draft treaty. And there's a draft that's been prepared by the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and that calls for a suspension of all ISDS settlements related to COVID-19, and includes the statement that the treaty would enter into force. This draft treaty would enter into force for every signatory country upon the country signing it. Now, others are calling for an agreement on a more wide-sweeping moratorium and permanent restriction on all arbitration claims related to all government measures that target health, economic, and social dimensions of the pandemic. Now, over time, there are longer-term measures that could be taken that include far-reaching reforms of current ISDS rules with much stronger carve-outs for all government measures intended to protect health, environment, economic, and social welfare. And UNCTAD, the United Nations Council on Trade and Development, is the leading intergovernmental discussions on such reforms. Now, more radically, countries could simply avoid agreeing to any new investment treaties. In the immediate COVID environment, signing the Intergovernmental Declaration or publicly affirming a moratorium on all ISDS related to actions taken by government in response to the pandemic are urgent actions that all states can take or should consider taking to give themselves some protection against potentially costly litigations of ethical legitimacy, and especially at a time when public resources need to be funneled into mitigation and control of a still rather raging pandemic. Thank you very much. That is it. Over to you, Manisha.
Thanks to you, Ronald. That was a very elucidative explanation for a very difficult subject. The ISDS is not very easy when we look at the different provisions, and particularly because it's the investor and the state which comes together. And but the moment you mentioned about the toll and the issues with respect to the ISDS, I thought it was a very lead question and a lead way to begin for our next speaker, which is Sudarshan Jain. And it's my pleasure to introduce Sudarshan Jain, who's the Secretary General of the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance. Interestingly, since the COVID started in March, around March, we actually have been engaged with him very closely in WHO as we navigate the supply of various medicines and drugs across different jurisdictions. In fact, our ADG, Mary Angela, has been holding weekly meetings, and Sudarshan has been tracking the progress of supply of many of these medical products across Europe and across US. And one thing I must share with you, that he has always been very reassuring, and in his calm and quiet way, he has made sure that there has been no disruptions. So Sudarshan, you have to tell us how exactly you did it, and what are the learnings you have from COVID-19, and how we can do better in terms of policy and as we move ahead for COVID-19 response. Over to you, Sudarshan.
So thank you, Manisha, for a very kind introduction. It was great to hear Professor Ronaldo and a very insightful talk, which has got a lot of implications for all of us during this time. All of us, as we know, and Manisha told, 23rd March, India announced the lockdown, and it has been one of the stringent lockdown, one of the strongest lockdown for last 6 months, 7 months now. We are going through the lockdown. And when it was announced on 23rd March, all of us at Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which comprises of 25 top companies in India and contributes 80% export from India and 60% supply to India, all the CEOs met and said that there is a great responsibility on all of us. We have to make sure that the supplies are maintained in a very difficult time. And the Prime Minister of the country said and asked us on a meeting on 22nd whether we will be able to make the supplies in a difficult situation. What I like to talk at this particular moment, it is a great case story that despite the most stringent lockdown, we have been able to meet our commitments. And what I will like to share with you, how did we meet the commitment and what are the learning for us going forward. This is also documented in the case study which has been created by Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, which is like Harvard of India. So on the day when it was announced, there were three kind of shocks which all of us had. One is the supply shock, second was the demand shock, and third was infrastructure shock. We didn't know how do we run the factories when there is a fear all around. We didn't know how the demand will vary of different products. We didn't know how our infrastructure, whether the transportation, flights, airport and ports will run. And all of us were wondering at that particular moment, how do we meet the responsibility? India contributes 60% of vaccine production to the world. It contributes the sale of every fourth tablet in Europe and every third tablet in US. So all our partners, whether it is Association of Affordable Medicine in US, IGPA, where I'm very active member, and the Medicine for Europe, as well as WHO were contacting us whether we will be able to meet our commitment. US FDA was contacting us whether we will be able to meet our commitment. At that day, we didn't know how the things will happen. During the month of March, 23rd March to 30th March, there was a lot of discussion with the government, but our production totally stopped. It went down to 15%, and we had to meet the supplies around the world. First thing which the government did, and Manisha is aware because Manisha has been part of various discussion with WHO, weekly we had the discussion. The government of India announced pharma industry as an essential industry, means thereby that the pharma production can continue, although other industries, the production cannot continue, like say consumer industries and other industries. The manufacturing plant cannot run for other companies, but pharma manufacturing plant can run. So the question is, government announced, and we have got a vast country. At that day, we said, yes, we can run now. But the question is, how does my worker reach to the factory? How do I make sure that, how do I communicate to the regulatory authorities, the police force who are making sure that people do not come out from home, that our people can come to the factories? There was a lot of fear in the families to come to the factories. So the first thing which we did is we started meeting all the CEOs of the company. We set up a system where we will meet every day in the morning at 10 o'clock. Whatever happens the earlier day, we'll prepare the report, supply the information to the government. In fact, the government and industry were working together 24/7. We'll supply which part of the country we are able to get the attendance of the people, which part of the country we cannot get the attendance of the people. How do we make sure that the infrastructure works? How do we make sure that the people are able to reach to the factories? So the first task was getting to the supply, getting to the continuous manufacturing. Second part was, how do we estimate the demand in the changed world? And third was, how do we make our infrastructure work? Because if we produce, but if the infrastructure is not working of transportation and flight services, nothing will happen. And also, if my factories work, but if my suppliers, ancillary industry, which supply my cartons, my wires, my packaging material, if they don't work, I cannot continue with the production for a long period of time. So the issue was, how do you manage your supply shock? How do you manage your demand shock? And how do you manage your infrastructure shock? So the first part which we said, let's have a regular communication. We will have regular communication first between the industry, second with the government, and third with all the stakeholders, whether it is WHO, whether it is ARM, whether it is IGPA, and all our partner organizations around the world. So the communication became a very, very important part of the overall exercise. Point number one. Point number two is we had to make our factories work. And the factories were not used to social distancing. Factories were not used to wearing the mask. The employee is not used to wearing the mask. At least the workers on the ground, when they are sitting in the canteen, The canteens, the food facilities are not used to that kind of thing. The transportation for the worker is not used to that kind of thing. So first part which we said is the safety of the employees is very, very important. We have to make the employee feel safe. In fact, we started making arrangement for the accommodation of the employees near the factory. As the colleges were not working, the hostels of the colleges were taken in where the people were kept in, so they don't have to travel, and all the safety is taken into consideration. The automation processes were increased in the factories, although it took time, but the distances were kept. In the canteens, in the companies, different times were given for different people to have their meals, so we could space out the employees. So a lot of changes in the processes were done to get the production going in. So the production which was not there in the month of March, it was almost 10%. We went up to around 35-40% in the month of April. But still we had to go a long way. So first the automation was done wherever was possible. Simplification of the processes were done. Factories started working instead of 8-hour shift. They started working for 12-hour shift. So there was more time for production. We wanted to make sure that the production takes place. So we reached to, and we were monitoring the production on a daily basis around the country. And we were submitting the report to the government of India. They were aware because in different parts of the country, how do we make sure that the employees are able to reach? And government was there to support as far as the overall process was concerned. Second, we came out with the safety guidelines with the government. And we also said that if the employees get detected with COVID, this is the process we will follow. And the government issued the guideline in the month of April, safety guidelines, which made sure that this is the process you have to follow. You don't have to close the whole factory. You have to close the part of the factory which has been impacted, do the cleaning, do the contact tracing, and make sure that operations are maintained, which were monitored by the regulatory authorities. Initially, we kept some of the factories closed for 2 to 3 weeks, but over a period, now we have streamlined the process. Only that part of the factory which gets impacted get closed. So the safety of employees was very, very important. The quality standards were very, very important. Safety, social distancing was very, very important. And I'm proud to say today that from the place in March where the production was around 10%, today most of the factories are running around 80 to 90%, despite the strongest lockdown, and despite we had during some days, we had 80,000 cases per day. Now we have got to 40 to 50,000 cases. But we have made sure that the system works and the production does not stop. Point number one. So supply was maintained and the processes in the company were streamlined to make sure that we are able to maintain the supplies. Second point, which was very, very important, was that we are able to maintain, as far as demand is concerned. Demand was zooming at different parts of the country in different particular ways. So we were calculating the demand. We put different models of putting the demand. There was stockpiling which was taking place. For some time, there were restrictions which were put in. And so we, like say, paracetamol demand went up for some period of time. Hydroxychloroquine demand went up for some period of time. So the companies set up the sales and operation process where we were able to get better estimate of the demand, and we started keeping the inventory level to a higher level, so we are able to meet the demand levels across the country. Third issue was to maintain the infrastructure. Like say, how do we make the transporters move from one place to another? So we made sure that transporters, they were not, all the transporters were made as essential and non-essential. That distinction was avoided, so transporters can move from one place to another. And also the airports, we worked with the airport authorities to start the flight, although the cost had gone up tremendously. And the ports were not working for some period of time. The government, the industry worked with those authorities to make sure that the infrastructure works. So if you see, the greatest learning during this time was a close cooperation and coordination between the government, between the industry, and all the stakeholders which are involved, whether it is supplier of ancillary industries, whether the transporters, or whether the distributors. There was a communication panel which was set in so as to make the availability. And then there were proactive measures which were taken. Like it is impossible to meet a bureaucrat, secretary, government of India for anyone for a week or 10 days time, but they were available 24/7 and they were taking proactive actions whenever it was required. So point number one was supply, demand, and infrastructure. To deal with it, coordination, cooperation is very, very important. Next point which I'd like to highlight is the issue of repurposed drug. India has played a very important role as far as repurposed drug is concerned. If you see Favipiravir, we have got around 6 to 7 manufacturers which are there in the country. If you see Remdesivir, we have got around 6 manufacturers and it is available at 1/10 of the price. So what all we did, the drug regulator in the country, he was working with the industries and making sure that the clinical trial happens at the record time and proper processes are followed to give the approvals. And we entered with Gilead as far as the licensing arrangement was concerned for Remdesivir. And today we are proud to say that we are able to meet the requirement of all repurposed drugs. Again, coming to the vaccines, India produces 60% of the vaccine production around the world, and all the vaccine manufacturers, most of the leading vaccine manufacturers, they have got collaborative arrangement, whether it is AstraZeneca or whether it is Johnson & Johnson, they have got collaborative arrangement with most of the manufacturers in the country. Also, three Indian companies, they are doing phase 2 and phase 3 trials, and we have ramped up the facilities as far as vaccine production is concerned. We have got around the capacity of around more than 1 billion doses, which we have created in the country. But production alone is not enough. We know transportation of vaccine is important. The vials and the accessories available, it is very, very important. And Government of India is already working with the manufacturer. Again, the example of close coordination, which is very, very important. So one of the lessons which I will say, very, very important lesson, if the government and the industry can start working together, it can help and deal with the situation. Point number one. Point number two is even the organizations, we were working, all the organizations, they work with tremendous competition. But if the association in these kind of crises, everyone works together, it can make hell of a difference, because what was important is the supply of medicine, the patient was very important, and we were able to make sure that we are able to meet consistent supplies. Some of the lessons going forward is the whole situation will continue. We have to maintain, we have to streamline our processes, make the processes simple. We have to focus on the safety of the employees. We have to focus on the quality, so there cannot be any compromise on some of the areas which are important, which is quality and safety. Point number one, which we said, and there has to be top management involvement at this situation. There has to be walking the talk. They were there on the factory floor, which is very important. So walking the talk, very, very important. Communication is very, very important. Simplification of the process is very important. And digitalization has assumed great significance during this time. So what we are working on is Indian industry is committed that we will be able to meet the requirement as and when it's required. We have developed the protocols, we have developed the processes and systems to make sure that we are able to meet the requirement. And we are committed to make sure that the patient receives the medicine, and no patient anywhere in any part of the world is impacted because of the availability of the medicine. Thank you very much. I will stop at this time and leave time for the question and answer. Thank you, Manisha. And thank you to all the participants and for listening.
Thank you, Sudarshan. And that was an excellent hands-on presentation on how you actually managed the COVID-19, because you were tracking the movement of products. And I liked your idea of simplification of processes. Often we make them overcomplicated. With these words, I really thank all our eminent panelists who have brought all the issues up on the table when we look at the COVID-19 and the trade issues that have dominated. We have a burning question from Sanya. Sanya Smith, could we please have her ask her question in person? Over.
Thank you very much. My question is to Professor Labonte. It's about the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is expected to be signed later this month on the 14th of November. And of course, that involves ASEAN, Australia, China, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, and India was initially negotiating. The text won't be released until it's signed, but what we see from the leaked investment chapter from 2015, which was obviously before COVID-19, was there were proposals to prohibit governments from requiring technology transfer or from setting maximum voluntary license royalties, for example, for vaccines or medicines, to ensure that they can be at affordable rates. There is an exception, it's negative list, so you can schedule sectors where you get an exception if all the other countries agree to it. So my question to Professor Labonte is if this is agreed to in RCEP, and any health exception for this chapter is the one copied from the GATT and the GATS, which, as you mentioned, is difficult to use, a 1 out of 44 success rate. What would be the impact on the ability of RCEP countries to access medicines, vaccines, and other COVID-19 technology they need at affordable prices, given that we know that voluntary license royalties for medicines can be as high as 30%? And of course, in other free trade agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I understand Thailand is considering joining, these rules are already there and they're enforced via the ISDS that you mentioned. And of course, the health exception does not apply to the investment chapter or the intellectual property chapter in the CPTPP. So given this, my question to Dr. Hill and Mr. Jain is that in the RCEP leaked intellectual property chapter, there are proposals for stronger enforcement provisions so that courts have the authority to order damages at the legitimate value submitted by the patent owner, for example, the retail price, the patented retail price, which can presumably be difficult for generics to afford given that they sell at a lower price and have smaller profit margins, as we heard. This is also, of course, in the CPTPP. So my question to you both is, can generics afford to pay the patented retail price per box of medicine or vaccine if they're found to infringe it, even if, despite their best efforts, they tried to invent around it, but in the end, a court found that they infringed the patent? And then lastly, of course, the RCEP services chapter is likely to require services liberalization, which can prevent lockdowns, curfews, or partial reopenings in the sectors which have been liberalized. So again, the general exception chapter may have that difficult to use WTO health exception. So my question to all speakers is, what are the implications for the ability to deal with COVID-19 and future pandemics if countries cannot do lockdowns, curfews, partial reopening because it violates their services market access commitments in these trade agreements? And of course, the EU is negotiating a free trade agreement with Indonesia during this pandemic, in which they have proposed a 25-year monopoly on industrial designs instead of 10 years under TRIPS. And as Doctors Without Borders pointed out, if you remember at the start of this pandemic, there was a shortage of ventilators and people were 3D printing ventilator valves to double up. Those ventilator valves cost $11,000 each. If they have a monopoly, 3D printed, they were $2 each. But with the industrial design protection of an additional 15 years that the EU is proposing to Indonesia, that would be 15 years longer that you have to wait before you can 3D print a ventilator valve, for example, during this pandemic. So I wondered if Professor Labonte would like to comment on the implications of negotiating these provisions during COVID-19. Thanks.
Wow.
That's a big question. Over to you.
Not a big question. There's a whole series of questions. I'll try to do what I can to answer them. This is obviously the RCEP is something that you've been watching and monitoring very, very closely. I have a lot of Australian colleagues that I've worked with on various ways. They've been handling the RCEP file, so I have not actually been kind of looking in detail at what some of those treaty provisions are. They sound pretty abominable. They sound sort of like they could have been written by the U.S. I'm not quite sure who is behind those huge TRIPS plus provisions or those investor state provisions within the RCEP agreement. But they're not very good. They're ones that today really ought to have been revised, kind of had an overhaul. I think that all of the various questions that you posed about how these agreements could affect access to technologies, access to repurposed drugs, access to vaccines, the problems with compulsory licensing, the requirement for a minimum amount of royalties, the inability supposedly in the investment chapter not to allow countries to actually negotiate beyond those or require a ceiling around what those royalties are. Those could be, I guess, subject to case-by-case, text-by-text amendments. There are probably a good reason why, though, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, a group of former UN special rapporteurs and many others are actually calling for an intergovernmental declaration that would be a moratorium on all ongoing, all future investor-state disputes, all investor-state cases, all claims for compensation throughout the pandemic period for a minimum of up to about a year after the WHO kind of declares that the pandemic is over. And that would require vaccine-initiated herd immunity. Now, that kind of a much broader single moratorium would put aside many of these other controversies that exist in those trade agreements. But they would, in the future, they would have to be reopened to avoid any problems of another pandemic, or even the access to repurposed drugs in the should another need for those repurposed drugs arise outside of the COVID-19 issue. So if we had a moratorium, if we had that declaration, if that took effect, then a lot of these problems you identify in the specifics of the trade treaty would actually be put on hold, but they would have to be dealt with at some point in time. Now, in the CPTPP, as you're probably undoubtedly aware, there were a number of sort of side letters that were initiated between some of the member parties to the CPTPP, essentially agreeing not to pursue an investor state, or not to allow an investor from their country to pursue or initiate a claim against a measure taken in another country. So there were efforts to sort of foreclose some of that from happening, and certainly on the state-to-state basis of dispute resolution. The implications, you sort of say, is that what are the implications going forward with this? Pretty awful. So that's maybe I'll kind of pass it back over to now to Andrew or to Catherine if they had more comments they wanted to make about some of the specifics you were asking about, for instance, repurposed drugs.
Thank you, Ronald. I think that does well in terms of covering some of the very difficult aspects of the ISDS and these regional trade agreements. While we wait for the turn, we can ask one of our other, Mr. Tun wants to ask a question of Sudarshan Jain. Maybe ask Mr. Tun to come online first, over. While we still wait to hear the connection, may I first request Andrew, we were talking about repurposing of drugs, and we were talking about, this is something that Ronald also mentioned. How do you see the repurposing timelines for many of the drugs that you have mentioned? And how do you see the clinical trial timelines evolving in the process? And where do you see us leading when we look at the COVID-19 situation? Over.
So that's a very interesting question. When we look at the different drugs, some of them have been very carefully coordinated and have clinical trial programs able to deliver evidence to a quality standard which could allow worldwide approval. But that's actually quite a small number of drugs. If you look at the drugs included in the Solidarity trial for the WHO, the Recovery trial for the National Health Service, and the new versions of those, there's a small number there. Apart from that, if you look at some of the other drugs, they have clinical trial programs in place. They might not be large enough to actually allow an evidence base to be built up to allow worldwide approval. I could go through a few particular examples, but I think the ones that stand out for me at the moment are favipiravir, the antiviral from Japan, nitazoxanide, the drug currently just released with the trial from Brazil, losartan, which is a large number of clinical trials behind it. And there are one or two other repurposed drugs that have the chance, probably within the next 3 or 4 months, to give us evidence to a level which could allow approval. We've got to be careful. I think it's the same with vaccines. People are saying we will have the results from a vaccine trial within the next few weeks. Doesn't mean that the vaccine is going to be successful. And the same thing with the repurposed drugs. We need to just hold back and wait for positive results to emerge, and then we can look at the upscale production. Some people are saying we should actually start producing some of these repurposed drugs at risk in case they are efficacious. That's quite a risk to take, though, and I think we really need to look at these one by one. And actually, if there are drugs which look promising but don't have trial programs quite large enough to allow a worldwide approval, that's an opportunity for more funding. But I'd say there's a short list of about 10 drugs now, which we should get results for within the next 4 to 6 months.
That's very heartening, because when we got some of the results from the solidarity trials for remdesivir, we were rather surprised, because it was unexpected, especially since it also had regulatory approval in certain jurisdictions. And so it's quite heartening to note that we are tracking some of the other drugs which could be useful in this process. Catherine, that takes us to a question for you. And what I wanted you to focus was on when you talked about the industry, regulator, and the procurer, and these are the three big pillars. And how do you see these coming together in terms of collaboration? If you could elaborate a little more on that, it would be so very useful for everyone. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Manisha. Well, I think we heard a very nice example from Dr. Jain about the industry regulator collaboration recently. Certainly, if we think about how to further foster that, industry collaborates or often is in an advisory situation with regulators from very early on in the development phase through to the application and approval process. But often, once the approval process is done, there are more limitations in terms of the information shared around the supply of ingredients and manufacturing, which is what kind of creates some of the risk to products, product quality later on. I think, as indicated, some of the greater information sharing can be voluntary, and it would be interesting to see how some of the newly emerging kind of R&D initiatives with respect to information sharing by industry are presenting examples of that. But ultimately, I think this type of information would be most helpful if mandated by statute, and that often comes into the challenge of balancing the interests of the commercial, confidential, and trade secret information with transparency needs for public health. In terms of the regulator-to-regulator cooperation, I think it's heartening to see a number of initiatives such as the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities converge around requirements for example, the guidelines for clinical trials for vaccines and others, the importance of working with the WHO in pre-qualification, and ultimately increased mutual reliance among regulators. And that basically means that regulators have the authorities to make decisions relying on data and information of others. And this is emerging, I think, increasingly in a regional context, sometimes with respect to sharing inspectional data, but could be much more widely expanded. And thirdly, with procurers, for donor-funded procurement, there is actually guiding principles that many donor organizations have adopted, which essentially lays out the quality specifications and requirements that they need to see in order to procure medicines that either approved by mature regulatory authorities, if not, then WHO pre-qualified, or if not WHO pre-qualified, then under some sort of abridged process using qualified expert review panels of WHO. And if not in those circumstances, then using internationally accredited wholesalers. So the procurement piece of this puzzle tends to rely on the wholesalers, but often as procurement decisions are made in many settings, regulators are in fact not at the table. So ensuring that there is good alignment between regulators and determining approved manufacturing sites and in auditing the wholesaler and distribution, I think we'll see greater transparency in the supply chain and more assurances to keep the poor quality products out of the market. Thank you.
Absolutely, and that is critical. Once we are able to handle the quality issues across various jurisdictions, I think we would have come a long way in terms of actually handling the various aspects in terms of holding onto the supply system's integrity and to make sure that we give quality products to our people. We do have a question for Catherine, for you again. And I will leave you to have a look at it by Brooke Baker. And while you do that, perhaps we can request Professor Labonte to come on board to explain how different is the interpretation of the courts? Is it in terms of the different ISDS provisions? And how does he see that fanning out in the COVID-19 situation that he has mentioned in his presentation? Over.
Okay, thank you, Manisha. I think the question was really how do tribunal decision-making, how is that the same or different from what national courts might decide? And it is different because the tribunals, first of all, are three persons and they're investment lawyers. One is chosen by whoever is the foreign investor seeking or making an allegation of a breach in the investment treaty rule. Another is by the country trying to defend itself. And the third is someone that's usually appointed mutually between the other two and functions more as a chair of the tribunal panel process. Because it doesn't work by common law, it doesn't work by precedents, it doesn't have the same kind of legal strictures sitting around it as what a court would have. Its decisions could be decidedly quite different because there's a much more limited range of kind of options or interpretations related to the, not so much the interpretations, but a much limited range of scope around which a tribunal will try to make a decision. The problem with the tribunals is that they're rather opaque. There are these potential conflicts of interest between tribunal members themselves, and there is no appeals process. Apart from a country that's faced with a huge penalty could try to seek relief from that penalty in a court someplace else, but there's no appeal for the actual decision. But I wanted to go back to a point that Sonia also raised about the real problem sitting inside agreements like RCEP. Now with the RCEP ingredient, it seems that the investment chapter, because it hasn't been made public, the investment chapter is highly bracketed at this point. So although there's a potential that it could go in the direction that Sonia you were describing, it could also be that in the context of COVID and in the context of what we've sort of seen with the renegotiations with the CETA agreement, trying to create the investment court system and how there's been pushback on European countries about doing that, that the whole ISDS system is in a state of critical flux. So if this was a very early chapter draft with full of bracketed text, it may be considerably different now. And as has happened in other agreements, it's quite possible before countries sit down to sign that there is a momentum to push the countries to basically make declarations of interpretation, how they will interpret those provisions and begin to put some restrictions around the use of those particular provisions. So they shouldn't be there in the first place, but there are possible mechanisms that countries could undertake with the RCEP agreement. And more broadly, I'll go back again to the idea that they should really look at signing on to that declaration around COVID and ISDS that the International Institute for Sustainable Development has drafted. Over.
Thank you, Ronald. That was a very useful explanation, particularly knowing how the tribunals function differently and how, being a three-member jurisdiction, they do respond differently as well, particularly because they're not bound by precedent. My question next is to Sudarshan. Sudarshan, you talked about simplification of processes, and you mentioned how simplification helped in the movement of products in terms of COVID-19 response, especially when you were accessing jurisdictions both nationally and internationally within the country and outside. So how did you bring about these simplifications, and what do you think we need to do more in terms of simplifying our processes to make sure that we have better access to medical products? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Manisha. Very, very interesting question, because what happens in many of the organizations is that we operate with silos. So manufacturing department works separately, and the systems are not shared with the quality control department, quality assurance department. They are not shared. Demand systems are not shared with the manufacturing department fully. So what we said to most of the organization, and we were taking the help of McKinsey, that we have to work more on autonomous systems where everything is integrated and silos between the organizations have to be broken down. So manufacturing, quality control, supply chain, all the systems were integrated together. So instead of relying on the person to give the information was available throughout the organization, that what is the production which is taking place, quality control, everything, all the parameters are put. So there is no need of a shop floor, someone is coming and putting the data. So all the systems integration across the functions of the organization, that was fundamental. And that was critical for making sure that we are able to move forward. It took some time initially. Some of the organizations were getting up geared to integrate it, but COVID accelerated this process of integration across manufacturing, quality control, supply chain, and the dispatch function, which was an important part of managing the overall supply position. Over to you, Manish.
Thank you, Sudarshan. That is absolutely critical. And I think once the different departments come together and we are able to ensure better coordination, this will really go a long way in making sure that the processes get more and more simplified. I can see that there was a question from Brooke Baker to Dr. Catherine Bond. Would you like to respond to it? Are we getting Brooke online, Secretariat, to ask the question in person? Over. So Catherine, maybe you could respond to the question about the interface between registration and emergency use authorization, and the fact how the stringent regulatory authorities and the WHO PQ come together for this process. Over to you.
Yes, I think the point that Brooke was making was that there is a difficulty or tension between the issuance of emergency use authorization by stringent regulatory authorities and the WHO pre-qualification and emergency use listing, and then the ancillary process of broad registration and emergency use authorization at the national level. And I think the concern here is that the emergency use authorization is slow and complex at the national level, while WHO is still deciding how to kind of balance between PQ and emergency use. And I recognize that this is a tremendously complex and difficult process, and also in the current context rife with political pressures. And I don't think there's a simple answer to this, but it just does point to the importance of increased data sharing and learning among regulators around the world. And with WHO, certainly we've seen emergency use authorizations issued and then found the products not to be efficacious or even to have safety problems. And so when regulatory authorities have the ability to share data and information and to learn incrementally, I think we can see sort of appropriate and timely use of the right authorizations at the right time. So just again, kind of pointing to the need for greater cooperation, greater communication, collaboration among regulators.
Thank you, Catherine. That was so very useful. I'm mindful of the time, and I realize that we have another 10 to 12 minutes to go. And I was wondering that we have such an eminent panel before us. If, when we look at assessing the situation for COVID-19 and international trade and health, if there is one thing that you think that you would like to suggest to the policymaker, what do you think that would be? And I would request the panel if you could answer that as we came up on board. So over to you, Andrew. If there is one thing that you think that you want, you would address in the COVID-19 situation and you had to put your hand on, what is it that you would like to suggest to our policymakers to make sure we get them on board? Over to you.
Yeah, so I think we can look at the mass treatment of HIV and tuberculosis and malaria as a potential model for COVID-19. We have the ability, we have a mechanism to treat literally millions of people with drugs at an extremely low unit cost and save millions of lives. And we've managed to circumvent all the legal problems around patents, compulsory licensing, ISDS. We've managed to get pooled funding mechanisms and get access to treatment in the poorest countries. I think we have a model for how to do this, and it shouldn't just be this medical success story that stands alone for these other diseases. I think it's time to apply this and look at a similar template for COVID-19.
Thanks, Andrew. In fact, you couldn't have stated it better. And what I really like about our HIV response is also it brought together all the stakeholders. We had a very strong civil society policy collaboration, and industry came on board, and that's how we were able to get across so much better in difficult circumstances. Over to you, Catherine. What is it that with your regulatory experience, and you bring up so much on board because you've seen the pharmacopoeia evolve as well, what do you think that you would like to suggest in the question of quality products for COVID-19, given your experience? What is the one thing that you think policy should bring on board? Over to you.
Thank you. Well, it's very heartening to hear Dr. Hill's presentation about the promise and prospect of affordable medicines. But ultimately, I think regulators hold the key to what actually gets into the markets. And so my plea is to invest in the regulatory system, invest in the regulatory workforce, and enable regulators to collaborate, to share information, and to advance and increase transparency in the supply chain so that we can really see a much broader global safety net for COVID and other essential medical products.
Thank you, Catherine. That is very critical in terms of ensuring the quality and safety of so many of the products that are under consideration. And to you, Ronald, what is it that you think you would like to put your hands on in this situation? Over.
Thank you. Well, I think that governments basically need to stop signing agreements or negotiating trade or investment agreements that do not have full enforceable carve-outs for any kind of non-discriminatory health, education, environment, or social measure that governments need to take in terms of promoting or protecting their own social welfare. Now, that's impossible for a lot of existing agreements, which is why then reinterpretation of that, renegotiating with declaratory statements that would advise panels in terms of how to avoid kind of getting bogged down in those kinds of disputes that would be contrary to the interests of people in all of the countries that are involved in those agreements. And as a sideline, it basically means, I think, that the trade negotiators, those people who are negotiating those agreements on behalf of governments, need to spend a lot more time with public health people. And public health people, in turn, need to sort of really bone up more consistently, more critically on what some of the trade issues and investment issues are.
Thank you. And that also looks at some of the issues we raised in terms of the RCEP, issues which were so very critical in the question and answer session. Over to you, Sudarshan. What is it that you would like to lay your hands on? Over.
So two areas, Manisha. One is the regulatory system, the way it is working for the COVID drugs. There's fast project management system, fast approvals, while following the standards. The same kind of process needs to be adopted for other drugs like chronic therapies, which takes much more time. So there has to be a learning what we have learned in the regulatory collaboration with the government, industry, regulator collaboration. Same can be applied to other therapies. So we can see faster availability of the medicines and drugs. and the use of technology that will become very, very important. Second point is there have been restrictions which have been put on trade during this time in different parts of the world. How can WTO play an important role to make sure that there has to be some mechanism where restrictions, there is a process, if we can deal with that, because global cooperation coordination will become very, very important. And these restrictions, whether it is repurposed drugs or whether it is ventilators or whatever it is, it has been common across the world. There has been more deglobalization at this particular stage. How do we get more cooperation and coordination between the governments to deal with the situation? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sudarshan. And Andrew Hill, we started with you, and it appears you're going to give us the final words. We have a question for you from Indonesia. Dr. Sugiharto, would you like to ask this question in person? Over.
Thank you for the time. Yes, I want to ask, what is your opinion about the vaccines that Indonesia will be imported from China that actually in phase 3? Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand the phase 3 and imports from China.
I believe, Sugiharto, would you like to repeat your question? It is the phase 3 clinical trials vaccine that is being imported into Indonesia. Over.
Indonesia will import the vaccines that actually in phase 3. What is your opinion about that?
Well, I mean,
so this must be the Sinopharm vaccine. Let me just clarify. Is that the one you're talking about, the Sinopharm vaccine, which is under consideration for Indonesia? Over.
I think so.
Okay.
From China, I think Sinovac and 2 of them, I forgot the brand name. But all of the vaccines are in phase 3.
So the question perhaps, Andrew, is that if there is a vaccine in a phase 3 clinical trial, is it good to go? Is it, if it is to be imported by a country, how good is the data in terms of a rollout of that vaccine for the population? I know you were talking about therapeutics here more than the vaccine. And you did mention about the HIV vaccine, AIDS vaccine in the beginning, but perhaps given the data that is currently available, as it is continuously evolving, what do you think is your view on this? Over.
I think we've got to be very careful predicting that vaccines are going to be efficacious. There have been cases of the original SARS vaccine for the disease back in 2004 is showing trends to increase the rate of infections. There have been similar trends for there was one HIV vaccine causing a similar trend. We cannot simply assume that a vaccine is going to work because we have a phase 3 trial in progress. All we have at the moment is a timetable for seeing results. And given the experience of previous vaccine research, unfortunately, we have to anticipate that the majority of these vaccines are not going to work. There could be success, but we actually have to plan for a plan B where we're using repurposed drugs for a few more months at least, if not a year, until the more promising vaccines emerge. And I would just urge a lot of caution here in thinking because a country is evaluating a vaccine, that vaccine is necessarily going to work. And we've had all sorts of upsets over the years in HIV and different therapeutic areas with the same experience.
Thanks, Andrew. I was wondering, Catherine, would you like to add to this, given the experience you have with respect to the stringent regulatory authorities and how they are going about the assessment of the vaccines, and where do we stand on that? Over.
Thank you, Manisha. And I agree with Andrew that we have to be very careful in terms of ensuring the most rigorous regulatory processes are adhered to. And I described such a process in my talk earlier. I think what we're seeing, for example, in the United States, given the pressures of trying to quickly approve a vaccine, regulators have maintained their independence, and they have, in fact, created further assurances in the decisions being data-driven, based on an independent scientific review committee that would then make recommendations. And I think we can't emphasize enough the importance of all vaccine registration going through this process. I do believe WHO is also involved with a number of member states in helping to assess data and information. And again, I think this is just another critical example of the importance of these thorough regulatory processes and much better woven collaboration and information sharing among regulators before any final approval decisions are made.
Absolutely. And in fact, WHO has also been engaging with different regulators to have a group of regulators who can examine dossiers in common. And it's something that is part even of the COVAX facility that is coming up. And then we do wish to make sure that a number of regulators come together and use the same criteria when we look at introduction of a vaccine candidate into the country. But I think, as you rightly said, great caution needs to be exercised. And this is something which is also emerging from the data, as Andrew and you yourself have pointed out. I do find between Brooke and Ronald, I think this is an interesting exchange because they have decided between themselves to answer the next question in tomorrow's webinar. And so that is a good way for us to look at the time. We are 3 minutes to go. So if there is any burning question from anybody, I open the floor. Or else I can start thanking the panelists for a very interesting presentation. I give a minute. Okay, Ronald.
I just wanted to then to sort of say, because Brooke posed a really important question, which was really about that the commercialization of all of these COVID interventions is being left to companies without any kind of real requirement on them to deal with how they're going to allocate them or make equitable distribution. And what do we do about that? What should governments do about that? So I think that's a really important question. This is sort of a teaser, is that tomorrow we're going to have a follow-up webinar on the same kind of trade, intellectual property kind of question. And Brooke will be one of the presenters I'll be moderating. So just for people to realize that if you want to get the answer to that, tune in tomorrow.
Thank you, because you have also set up the opening remarks for tomorrow's session, which is so very critical for tomorrow. And I think we did go through a very detailed discussion today, and thanks to Andrew, we have a great idea in terms of how the therapeutics are coming up. What are the issues we need to keep on board? And I like the way he started, and he said that when he started working and they said that, okay, a vaccine is about to come out, and it doesn't really happen because the process is so long, and it takes a long time between the science to evolve and the science to make things available to the people. We did go through a very detailed discussion today, and thanks to Andrew, we have a great idea in terms of how the therapeutics are coming up. What are the issues we need to keep on board? And I like the way he started, and he said that when he started working and they said that, okay, a vaccine is about to come out, and it doesn't really happen because the process is so long, and it takes a long time between the science to evolve and the science to make things available to the people. So with these words, I thank all the participants, our eminent panelists. I thank Mr. Sudarshan Jain, Catherine Bond, Ronald Labonte, and Andrew for a very interesting and detailed presentation. And I wish us lots of luck in handling COVID-19 in the next few months as we go along. And I wish you all the best, Ronald, for your session tomorrow morning. Tomorrow, over to you.
And thank you, Manisha, for handling this so well.
Thank you so much.